Hi, everyone. It's Murray here. I'm by myself, but I am interviewing Roel Konijnendijk today about his current work and what he's doing scholarship-wise, and we've got lots of things to cover. We were about to kick off just off air, and it was like, oh, we should probably record this. So, Roel, what have you been up to?
Yes, thanks, Murray. Thanks for having me. So what I've been up to the last couple of years is a study of historiography, which is, it sounds awfully boring. It sounds like navel-gazing, but basically looking at how historians have in the past studied a particular part of history, how they've written about it, where their ideas come from. And specifically, I'm talking about Greek warfare. Obviously, my field is classical Greek warfare. I'm interested in the developments and the nature of Greek warfare and how Greek ways of war respond to those of their neighbors. And the interesting thing that I found when I was doing research into Greek warfare proper, the actual subject, was that I found that a lot of our ideas about that history don't necessarily come directly from the way that the sources tell the story. They don't come from the way that, Herodotus or Thucydides or Xenophon describe what the actual fighting looked like or how armies were organized, but it comes from sort of legacy ideas from earlier historians. So they come to it with a certain interpretation of this is what it must have been like. And we just kind of build on that. And so for a very long period of time, until really a few decades ago when this model started being changed, we were kind of repeating at each other a model of Greek warfare that we had received from scholarship that isn't really there in the source material, that isn't really explicitly there. You could find some ways to support it. You can find some bits of evidence here and there that can kind of build up to that picture. But it seems to me like if you just read the source material, you come up with something very different and something closer to the way that we now talk about it. And so I got really interested in the idea of where does that come from? Why do we have that idea? Why does it stick around so long? And that's what I've been looking into, just the question of, okay, if we have this perception of what Greek warfare is like, how do we end up with that?
And that culminated in the book for Brill, yeah? The Between Miltiades and Moltke, Early German Studies in Greek Military History.
That's right, yeah. So that's the second book that came out just last December, which is the result of this whole research. It's a short monograph. It's basically half a book in which I just look at these earliest scholars who have done sort of serious academic work about Greek warfare.
Is our modern, like until the last sort of 30 years, is the modern idea of Greek warfare the Prussians' fault? Is that roughly?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, so the idea is that these early scholars, they are Germans for the most part, or from German-speaking countries, and they're not all like from what is now Germany. Some of them are Austria. Some of them are working in Switzerland because they're in exile. But I call them Prussians because they have this sort of militarism about them. And several of them are professional, like military officers. And so, and many others have military experience. They volunteered for the army, they fought in the Franco-Prussian War, they got involved in this themselves. Or, one of them has, a son who died in World War I and these kind of things. So you have their personal involvement in war, which colors their way of looking at it. And so I feel like Prussians, when we think of Prussians, you're already hearing the sort of the boots hitting the pavement kind of thing. You sense this militarism. So in that sense, I think the word it brings out the right associations, even if it isn't technically right. But yeah, so they have a particular way of looking at this history, which later scholars, when other parts of the world start studying the same subject, and especially the English-speaking world, these handbooks are already there that were written by these Prussians. And so they're drawing on that to build their own work. And they are sometimes unconsciously, sometimes very deliberately, but inheriting this idea, this way of looking at warfare in the past. And they then take that forward. And when they sort of develop their own ideas, it's always built on this bedrock of the way that this has been done in the 19th century. It's always built on this sense of like, well, this is basically what we know, and now we can work from there. And they don't really fundamentally question that bedrock. They don't actually go in and say, well, is this actually right? And that's where the interesting sort of distortion comes from, essentially.
So what's their biggest mistake, do you think, that this bedrock is this foundation of sand, if I can get all biblical?
It fundamentally boils down to, as I wrote in the first book that I wrote, so Classical Greek Tactics, which came out some years ago, 2018, I tried to describe this as the Prussian model of hoplite battle, which is it's very rigid. It's an understanding that all of Greek warfare is about fighting these pitched battles, which are very simple and they follow a standard template. So they always go through the same motions, essentially. That there is very little variation in what a Greek army does when it encounters another Greek army in the field. And that thereby you could sort of say, okay, well, that's your baseline of tactical development. You have these hoplite armies. they will say that non-hoplite forces don't have any influence on this. They don't matter. They're all about hoplites. Hoplites will always have the same formations. They always have the same battle plans. The same things happen in these battles, and you can kind of predict the outcome. And in the old view of this kind of development, it really takes someone like Epaminondas or Alexander the Great to fundamentally change the way that battles are fought. And so that's the idea that they have, is that there is a sort of fixed Greek way of doing things where all wars are resolved by these pitched battles that follow the same very rigid formula. Effectively, it's a formula. It's just like you put your numbers in and then an outcome pops out. And that it takes these sort of singular tactical geniuses to try and change that and to develop it into something more sophisticated, something like, combined arms warfare, for instance. And that model, that still has an enormous legacy. You still hear people, especially people who study Hellenistic warfare, are much more inclined to still say these kinds of things, and say that Alexander invented combined arms warfare and things like that.
Yeah, and even the ones who turn around and say that, that Epaminondas, for instance, there is no revolution. It's an evolution, not a revolution. And
right. And I think that's much more what you're seeing, is that actually, a lot of these battles are much more varied. There really isn't a template, a single way of this happens. Their formations change. The composition of these armies are very varied. The way that they try to win battles follows at least two basic template plans, and very many variations that we can see in the sources. And of course, they're already aware that, just hoplites by themselves are terribly vulnerable. So you need to try and use other forms of other weapons to try and mitigate that and to try and maximize the advantage that they have. And so, this idea that Greek warfare is very formulaic and very sort of formalized. I think that's the biggest mistake of this model. And they do that because they're trying to tell a story of tactical development, right? They're trying to tell a story of how you get from, a very basic organization to a more sophisticated one. But I think in doing so, they gloss over and they generalize over so many complexities and nuances that it becomes almost meaningless. What you're talking about is a completely abstract model that doesn't actually exist in any single, historical battle.
Yeah, and when there is a battle that doesn't fit it, like Plataea, for instance, you're like, oh yeah, we'll either make it fit the model, or we'll kind of go, something odd happened here, but let's not talk about that. But whereas Marathon or Thermopylae fit the model,
becomes really difficult. Yeah, and the bigger picture as well, that when you have this model where Greek warfare is all about these formulaic pitch battles, it becomes very difficult to explain when Greeks don't fight their wars like that. When they do something like, like Pericles did in the Peloponnesian War and says, we're not going to fight a battle. That then becomes this huge problem for them. And they have to try and explain this as some kind of massive strategic revolution. When in fact, it's a common practice for people to avoid a battle that they think they're going to lose. Obviously they have been doing that since, time immemorial. And so other approaches to warfare, skirmishing, raiding, siege warfare, naval warfare, become very difficult to explain when you've already decided in advance that Greek warfare is going to be all about these pitched battles, right? So it causes more problems than it solves, really, because it creates a model. It creates a sense of like, we have Greek warfare down pat, it works like this, and anything that doesn't fit that is, it's an exception. It didn't really matter, it didn't really change anything, so we could just sort of set that aside. When in practice, if you try to include all those things, you end up with a very, very different picture and something much more interesting, because it gives the Greeks much more agency, basically. It lets them be clever, it lets them be stupid, it lets them be inventive, all sorts of things.
All right, well, if we flip that then, what's one thing that these German-speaking scholars got right that has been neglected or ignored?
Neglected or ignored, I wouldn't necessarily say, but one thing they're really very good at is they know these sources inside out. They're really, really good, strong philologists in the sense that they read these texts and they argue over the precise meaning of every single word. And so they will know, when they say that this is what it says, a lot of the time you can't improve on that. You can't necessarily tell them, oh, this is actually, we don't read it that way. It's actually pretty much solid. So, for instance, in the 1850s, some of these scholars that I studied, Kochly and Rustow and Hermann Kochly, made the first sort of editions and translations of the tactical authors. So, like, these tactical manuals by Arrian and by Elian and Aeneas Tacticus and all these kind of figures. who wrote about the way to organize, a city under siege or a Hellenistic army. They're the first to collect these texts in the modern editions, and those editions are still valid. Like, you can pick those books up and be like, yeah, this is a good version of the text. This is a valid translation of that text, except that it's in Gothic. But it's like, it's still relevant. And there isn't, in fact, a single work that replaces the collection that they put together in the 1850s. I mean, there are lots of new editions of all of these texts, but not a single work that puts them all together. And so in that sense, collecting the evidence and understanding the evidence and knowing what it means, they were exceptional at that. And they're still respected for that, for the work that they did, putting it all together. The problem usually is with their interpretation and with their selection, basically the understanding of what's important and what isn't, or what's significant and what isn't. That's where we end up, diverging very far.
Well, yeah, even in modern editions of those authors, you find, them referred to in the apparatus criticus for their philological.
Because in a lot of those cases, yeah, they're the first and often the only version that we have that's really has the kind of thoroughness that we require.
And I think one of the things with the Aelian and the Asclepiodotus and the Arian is like, beautiful numbers, mathematical precision of the Hellenistic army, 16,392 phalangites. Beautiful. Let's divide that by 2 ad infinitum. Oh, it's glorious.
And they love that. I mean, obviously these Prussian authors, when they read that, they think, yep, that's how an army works. And that's the problem. That's kind of the problem, is that some of these sources seem to confirm them in their understanding that this is all really quite mechanical and quite, meticulous. Because, I mean, I end up sort of sounding like I'm contradicting myself. On the one hand, I'm arguing that the Greek way of war was more sophisticated, but on the other hand, I'm also arguing that it's much simpler. This is about like which part of it you're looking at, right? So in terms of tactical organization, for the Prussians, what they read in those manuals, like you said, the subdivision of the phalanx and all these different units and everything, the numerical precision of it, they thought that would have applied backwards. You can send that back in time all the way to the beginning of the classical period. As far as they're concerned, there's no problem there because that's how armies work, right? They take that for granted. For us, actually, when we read something like Herodotus describing warfare, we can see that he doesn't talk about those things. It's much simpler. It's much more basic. He doesn't give you any numbers. He doesn't even give you the number of ranks of a formation. And so we probably can't assume that these later, institutions, or even, what you find in the Hellenistic tactical authors, philosophical abstraction of institutions, the idea of mathematical perfection, that doesn't apply to the way that a Greek state organizes a militia on the spot for a war that's already going on. You cannot expect that. On the other hand, there's just thinking about military conflict and how to resolve it. That's where there's a lot more variation. That's where there's a lot more, I think, sophistication early on.
And I think they use it, fill in gaps. And there are so many gaps, like you get that amazing thing of the standard depth of a hoplite phalanx. And it's like, when you look at all literature, there's like 20 instances of the depth, and they're not the same depth. They are 4, 8, 16, 20, 25, 50, if you trust Herodotus, Xenophon. So, hang on a minute, that's it. And so the whole idea that there's a standard is very kind of like, that's made on a very flimsy basis.
Yeah, and so this is exactly the kind of thing that, some of these authors are a little bit hesitant. They're like, I'm not sure this is standard, or is it just like a common practice? But then when it comes down to it, they will just write that down and they will say it's always 8. And you're just like, this isn't true. Like, you've read all these sources, that there's a lot more variation. And in fact, that some of the armies where we expect the greatest rigidity, like the Spartan army, which obviously had a higher level of organization than other Greek armies, but they just become completely arbitrary. They just say like 9 or 10, 12.
Mantinea. Each Lokagos decided for himself the depth of his line, but it was on average 8.
They don't care in the way that we do about standardization. They certainly don't care in the way that Prussians do about standardization. But that's where I think a lot of the problem lies, is that these guys are looking for the rules and the standards, the benchmarks, the model. And if they don't find it, then they will just impose it on the evidence. They will just say that it's there.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because I love using 19th century warfare to break down that model, because that model of a rigid, ordered, there's, 476 of them in this, and you're like, yeah, but in Napoleonic warfare, you could have 100 guys left of a regiment. It's still the regiment, but it is so far under strength it's not funny. But so that idea of like when you say that, you're not talking the theoretical number. And then with the Vindelander tablets, for instance, it's like, yeah, there's a legion, but there's 50% of that legion is doing something else. So don't give me 5,400. And I think one of the other things that's always amazing, and I'm never able to write in the way that, the 19th century, well, actually all 19th century scholars wrote with such incredible self-confidence that they write that they are right. And I am right, and there is no possible contradiction to what I am telling you. I think that continues. I mean, when you read Ronald Syme, it's the same. It's like, oh, wow, I couldn't possibly write with that kind of,
Yeah, there is a certain confidence of knowledge, which they have clearly earned from many years of reading this and from growing up studying the ancient languages as well, which is just, it puts them a level above us in a way that we struggle to keep up. The other part is that, they derive a lot of status from what they're doing. I mean, being a university professor in this period is an enormous sort of pedestal, essentially. Like, you are a historian, people look to you as somebody who knows history, and they wouldn't dare question you unless they had some way to validate that claim. But this is where you actually run into the problem that I described. So I don't know if you want to sort of switch over to that, but the problem of authority is a huge problem when you're writing specifically about something like ancient warfare. So they run into the problem that although they as historians have a tremendous amount of authority on history and on its interpretation, they run into a rival claim to authority when they start writing about warfare. One other thing they do really well that I just want to flag up, because we kind of imagine that German scholars, I guess by stereotype, not necessarily in any sense by practice, but are seen as being very dry and stodgy and meticulous to the point of being sort of unreadable because they're they're pumping so much information into the density of their text. When you read these 19th century German scholars, they are really easy to read. They're incredibly accessible. I mean, once you get through the Gothic, it's actually really easy to read that because they know that they have a wider readership than just other academics. They know that they're writing for a wider audience, and that's just assumed, that's just accepted within that society, that a historian is always going to have a wide readership among the educated civic, elite. And so they are writing for people who might not have their education, and they're trying to explain these things to them in a way that allows them to pick it up and make it part of their frame of reference. And so a lot of their writing is actually really easy to read. And I really admire that in the way that they end up writing these really, really fundamental works, which are nevertheless, really accessible.
And are they walking battlefields in a much more modern sense? And is that tied with that as well?
So some of them are doing it for fun, where it doesn't really affect them very much, but they will just go and see it because they feel like they ought to, and it's just part of the charm of doing this kind of work.
I'm in Australia. I envy anyone who's able, who's an hour's drive from battlefields, but
Well, the really poignant one that I like to cite is, so Hermann Kochly, who I already mentioned, he co-wrote the first great handbook on Greek warfare in 1852. He never went to Greece until the very end of his life, 1878, I think, or 1876 rather, when he went on this tour, and he went to the battlefield of Marathon, and he fell off a horse, and it was all very sort of very, very awkward. But then on the way back, he contracted what seems to be a bladder infection, and he actually died. And he's buried now in Heidelberg, where he was teaching. And on his tombstone is in Greek, his name in Greek, like they just turned it into, sort of Hellenized his name. And then it says, I died, but not before I saw Athens. He feels like this was the culmination, or at least the way that he chose to be remembered is that the idea of actually seeing Greece was the culmination of all of his life's achievement, which I think is really beautiful, but also really tragic. Because obviously, he could have come back and written, who knows how many more wonderful works of scholarship. But instead, he decided that that this was something that is worth saying. Like I already did everything. I achieved the highest. That's for introduction, because that's purely the idea of seeing the Greek world. But the battlefields, initially they don't, because that isn't considered to be part of what they're doing. They're doing this very philologically, right? They're gathering the text and they're tracing in that way. And the earliest maps, because in that period there are no maps of the ancient world like we do now. We have those atlases of the ancient world. There's nothing like that. So they have these really crude sketches. They're really wonderful to look at where you're just like, yeah, I see that you have the basics, but no one really knows. And genuinely no one knows, right? Because those maps don't exist. What it actually looked like on the ground. People have traveled through it, they've seen it, but they haven't done the sort of the measurements and that kind of thing. So that's only starting to be done. But then in the course of the debates between some of these scholars, eventually one of them hits upon the idea, looking at the equivalent kind of military histories that are being written by the army. They look at that and they say, look, one of the things they really use all the time and really rely on as a way to recount battles is really detailed maps. And so if we want to debate these, ancient battlefields, we should have maps like that. And so that's when he asks for the help of officers, because they're the ones who make these kinds of maps. So he contracts, he builds connections with the general staff, first in Germany, then in Austria, and he has connections in this general staff of France and Italy. And they just send officers along with him to go to these ancient battlefields, to do the measurements, make the maps, and that then becomes his big selling point. Is like, I am using the latest geographical material, but I'm also using the autopsy, right? Which is something that very interesting. Polybius, the ancient historian Polybius, already said that you need to go and see these places for yourself if you want to write the history. That's a very important part of your information gathering. But they just didn't do that until they felt that they needed it to kind of break the deadlock of their debates. So they need some kind of new information.
The amazing thing about those maps is those maps are still top-notch in many cases. Well, where the battlefield is still regarded as that site, because there's a few that was like, yeah, that's not where it happened.
And very interestingly, I mean, when you look at maps that have been made since, you can really tell the difference between the ones that got the help of, for instance, the Greek military academy and those that didn't. Because the difference in quality is vast. I mean, if you wanted to make a map like that, you would go ask the army, like, can I use your maps? Because they have the best maps. They need them for their planning. They need them for their ranging and for their defensive planning, for their strategic planning, all sorts of things. And so for recently, this volume came out, the Battle of Plataea, for instance. Those maps are superb because they used Greek staff maps to help them with the topography. And that's the kind of thing that kind of shows that the way they did that back in the early 20th century was ultimately the way forward if you want those really detailed maps. And you can still use them. You can still pick up the books that were written then and look at those maps. And they still, when you do your Google search and you find an image of a battle plan with red and blue blocks on a map that is all black and white otherwise, those maps are chrome iron white maps. They come from one of those series. So they come from one of the authors at AW249.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fascinating thing about that is that the topography that they were dealing with, hasn't been altered the way it is now. And you read some of these battle maps and a lot of these features are no longer there. Whereas mid-19th century, there's not a lot of development in these places. So actually they were looking at them. I mean, Leuctra obviously and Plataea are largely unaltered, but some of the others are like, yeah, that's now a suburb. You're like, oh.
Yeah, it can be really difficult because obviously, I mean, humans and space, people live there, people have stuff to do, and then people have lives to live. Obviously, preserving ancient battlefields cannot be the highest priority of any area unless they specifically sort of mark it out and say, like at Gettysburg or in some parts of the ancient world as well, the former ancient world. But that is one of the advantages that they had when they started making these maps is, it was still a fairly sparsely populated, for the most part, area where they could sort of roam around. But that also meant that it could be very dangerous. So one of these guys who did a lot of these maps, who was an Austrian officer called Gerd Veit, he went off to do another one of those in what is now Turkey. He went to this ancient battlefield of the Mithridatic Wars, I think, or the Roman Civil War, in one of these first century BC battlefields in Asia Minor. And he didn't survive because he went over there alone against the advice of the local police. He was accosted by some local people who may have been shepherds or bandits, is unclear. He didn't understand what they were saying. They didn't understand what he was saying. They got into a fight and he got killed. It's not that there is no law. I mean, there was a police officer of the Ottoman Empire that he talked to, and he said, "Don't do this, you idiot." He went anyway because he was, a a very self-confident veteran of World War One artillery regiment. And he, he paid for it with his life, because these are not, they're not sort of cultivated spaces in the way that a modern historic battlefield often is. You can go down from where I am in London, you could go down to the battlefield near Battle at Hastings, and you can go and see this very manicured, space where English heritage has set itself up as, the curator of the historical battlefield. But obviously, these are just wild, in use spaces where local populations will look at this weird guy and his, with his sword and his uniform. It's like, what the hell are you doing here? Like, don't scare my flocks, and don't tread on my land. This kind of attitude, obviously, it will come out. There was another case in North Africa where he had to fight off wolves, apparently. So,
is there any trust in oral tradition? Like, you've got people who've been living on this land, which is a battlefield for millennia, and like Pausanias, when he records these sort of like, the locals say that this is that and this is that, and is there any kind of trust in that tradition, or is there a very...
I don't know of any single example where a memory that old survives in local oral tradition, like, oh, this was the site where X and Y fought a battle. I think if those things exist, most likely they are retrospective, like somebody, heard about the Herodotean accounts and then came back and said, oh, this is where it happened. And then the villagers start telling the story, because that's obviously really great to be made part of this great narrative. I think the only one is that the battlefield of Cannae, I think, is still called the Field of Blood, but I'm not sure how new that name is. And so that's the kind of thing, the problem that you have in a lot of these cases, and especially with the formation of modern nationalism, is that ancient narratives are deliberately revived, and ancient localities are deliberately revived. I mean, Sparta was refounded, not because that place is a particularly great place to found a new city, but because there is this sense of like, well, we should still have that, but we don't at the moment because the town was abandoned and moved. So we should just refound it in the exact same place, because then we can say Sparta is right here, Sparta is still there. So you have these kinds of occasions where even though something looks like a continuous tradition, you can't really trust it as such, because there's obviously a lot of interest in blaming that history, in blaming that continuity, in saying that, despite all the things that happened to us as Greeks or as Turks or whatever else, we never changed. We are always aware of our great history. And so I think that's something to be very wary of, not because that's a problem, let people have the stories that they want to have, but also it isn't necessarily history. And so that's something to be very very wary of. And so you don't hear these guys sort of going off talking to the locals and saying, oh, this is what they say.
Mind you, I think the other thing, of course, is that the ancients were doing it as well. Cheironea, the lion monument at Cheironea, you're like, it's, I think in most reconstructions of the battle, it's regarded as a locale of the battle. And you're like, and yet it's in the wrong place. They've clearly been moved there and lined up.
Yeah, and you have really interesting ones. I mean, you mentioned Pausanias, who's obviously writing in the 2nd century AD. Pausanias is the first and only source to mention the famous battle at Hysiae, which supposedly happened in 689 BC or something. It's like this great Argive victory over the Spartans, which supposedly the local population remembered for 800 years, even though no source before that ever recorded it. There's no monuments, there's nothing, no trace of it anywhere. Do we believe that? I mean, obviously a lot of historians have believed that and have written that down. It's the Battle of Hysiae, 669, one of the great milestones of the Archaic period. We know nothing, and we have no reason to believe that Pausanias suddenly unearthed this kind of great memory of this fantastic historical event. It's much more likely this is just a local tradition that was made up because it sounded cool, or because it was a transformation of another story into something that was locally relevant.
Or the locals are very much like the Egyptian priests talking to Herodotus going, let's pull his leg today. Let's tell him about this great thing. And oh, yeah,
right.
Great.
Like, who knows? Like, Pausanias is so selective and is so guided by, he's as good as his guides, undoubtedly. And so anybody who wants to tell him a story about the great victory over the Spartans, which obviously is great if some local area could claim this is where the Spartans were defeated, that's a great story, So these kind of things we can't necessarily trust, and that applies exactly as you say already to the ancients themselves.
So is there cynicism towards the sources in these Germanic scholars?
There is a lot of a critical approach, but I would say it's selective in the sense that they decide fairly early on, and I think a lot of ancient historians still do, that some ancient historians are trustworthy and others are not. And so, for instance, with Herodotus, they can be very skeptical. With Xenophon, they can be very dismissive. They think that he's not very good. But for instance, Thucydides and Polybius, they have almost absolute faith in these guys. Right? They have this reputation of being incredibly reliable. And this actually becomes one of the great problems when one of them, Hans Delbrück, who's by far the most famous of the scholars that I've covered, because he did so much other military history as well, and because he's regarded as one of the founding figures of the field of military history, which is not quite accurate as I've argued, but it's definitely a reputation that he has. And his thing is that he is very, very critical of every source, because he has a certain understanding of how military history works. And if the source doesn't confirm that, then he's like, well, the source is probably wrong. And this leads him even on some cases to criticize Polybius. And that is actually one of the things that spurs other scholars to resist him, to push back against his theories, is they say like, well, you can't question Polybius. If you question Polybius, we have no legs left to stand on. Like that is one of the guys that we have to be able to trust, right? Otherwise we know nothing about anything. And so criticizing Polybius is a huge problem. Like it's very difficult for these scholars to tolerate. And they get into decades-long controversy over whether Polybius might be fallible after all, which is existential to them. They cannot let that go. Somebody like that must be right, and if the facts don't bear it out, then the facts must be wrong. It's that kind of level of thinking. Some of them do the same with all the ancient sources. Some of them are really not that critical, not that interested in criticism. They just collect the evidence, and so when somebody like Hans Delbrück also says, the Persian Wars happened very differently from the way Herodotus tells them, they will also just say like, well, you can't just dismiss the evidence, right? You can't just say Herodotus was wrong because we don't have that. What do we have? What are we left with? And that is a valid point, I guess.
Yeah, Diodorus, who's like one of the hardest done by ancient historians, because he gets dismissed by everyone. Probably another one of these foundations is like trust of Thucydides and Polybius, and cynicism and dismissal of virtually every other source, especially if they disagree with Polybius and Thucydides. They must be wrong. They can't possibly be right.
No, absolutely. There's this sort of canonization, but this is more generally going on in the 19th century in German scholarship. But it's just canonization of Thucydides in particular as the great historian, the example we all follow. And apparently there are some really nice quotes from people like Ranke, the greatest names of German historiography, who say like Thucydides is, the guy you want to be, when you grow up. That's the kind of thing they hold that up as the gold standard. And so I don't know of anybody who actually says Thucydides was wrong. I think even Hans Delbrück doesn't go there, but he's not that interested in the period. And this is the kind of thing that it's always disappointing when you go into it, when you study a field like I do. I study classical and archaic and classical Greek military history for the most part. And a lot of these authors just aren't that interested in that. So firstly, Delbrück, he starts his military history with the Persian Wars. He thinks before that we have no good evidence. We don't have any narratives, so we can't do it. It cannot be done, he says. So I'm not going to bother. So the entire archaic period, he just lops it off and says, not my business. That's not military history, he basically says. That's just fables. And so he starts there, but then, the entire classical period, he's not really that interested. He kind of gets into it when he gets to the Hellenistic because Polybius. So that's the thing that he's really engaged in. That's the thing that really animates him, is arguing with the kind of accounts that you get from Polybius in particular. And then later the Roman stuff, and then everything leading into the Middle Ages, which is was his thesis and is his original specialism.
So is there anything where archaeology or a find has proven some of these theories right?
Not really, in the sense that archaeology is kind of included when they're talking about weaponry, when they're talking about, the armaments, the way things looked. But they're not terribly interested in the archaeology. I mean, the archaeology of battlefields isn't done, right? That isn't the thing. You can go there for autopsy, but you don't dig around. Survey archaeology hadn't been invented as a concept, so you don't go and look around on the site. And then what you're left with is essentially, it's the objects or the weaponry, which they include, but then it doesn't have any sort of wider implications to them. which is an interesting aspect. They don't do what later authors would do, which is invest a huge amount of significance in, for instance, the shape of the shield or the shape of the helmets that Greeks would use. They don't really do that at all. There's a wonderful remark in Kromeyer at one point where he just says like, oh yeah, the Mycenaeans had these big figure of 8 shields, and then later the Greeks had these round shields. But in practice, what's the difference really? It's kind of the same thing. And you can imagine, like I'm seeing you laughing now, like you can't imagine a modern scholar saying something like that. As far as he's concerned, heavy spearman's a heavy spearman, who cares? Which is remarkably close to how the Greeks saw it, as far as we can tell,
Hoplite's not a technical term, just you're a hoplite, you're a hoplite. But
you get a big shield, you're good. Yeah, that sort of thing. And so they were really interested in kind of the implications. That comes out in the early 20th century, but these are not archaeologists, so they don't really work with that so much. And then the other major thing, of course, is fortifications. But in that case, not that many of them have been explored. This is still actually going on. There are huge parts of the Greek world where fortifications just haven't been extensively studied. In places like Athens, where some of the best remains are, they were still buried at the time. They weren't exposed, they weren't visible. And so a lot of this kind of stuff just either isn't available to them, or they're not that interested, or they don't have the means to go and explore it in depth. And so archaeology doesn't really shape their theories, and insofar as it has been done since, it doesn't really affect them in the sense that they aren't really talking about the same kind of things, I think.
So what's next with this field? Have you got the second half of this volume to do, or
no? So this was the completion of this research project, where I'm trying to argue that, I mean, the essence of it, which I haven't really actually gotten into, is fundamentally the idea that these scholars, the reason why they write this history in this particular way, in this sort of progression of tactical developments with an exclusive focus on pitched battle, the way that they argue that Greek warfare worked, it's all about pitched battles between hoplites, and they're all sort of the same. The reason why they did that is because they are writing in a world where military history as a field of history doesn't exist. There is no such thing. No one is a military historian in this world. And in fact, Hans Delbrück, who's often described as the first military historian, officially wasn't. I mean, he wasn't allowed to be. He was told he couldn't be, because that field didn't exist, right? Military history as a field didn't exist at all. The people who did military history were officers, members of the general staff. And this is true in the German-speaking world, but it's true everywhere else as well. You can see that military history of this period almost always either is produced by officers or in collaboration with officers. And the reason is that they are studying military history to learn how to do war, essentially. They're trying to get better at it.
Even some of the translations are, I'm translating Polyaenus for the first time into English as a handbook for officers. That's 1793. Frontinus is 1814. They're by officers for officers as handbooks of warfare.
Precisely. So the earliest kinds of collections of information about the ancient art of war, I mean, they all come from people like Nast and all these other guys, Guichard, who are all themselves officers. And so they're doing that exactly, as you say, by and for officers. And so the problem that these historians are facing is that officers essentially claim military history, and they say, you don't know how to do this. Firstly, you've never done it. And secondly, you don't know the business. You're not a soldier, therefore you don't understand this field, right? There is a clash of legitimacy, a clash of authority, where officers just tell the historians, you can't do military history because you don't understand warfare like we do. And so it becomes very difficult for them to write military history from an academic point of view, like with an academic sort of approach, because the soldiers will tell them, like, you didn't ask us, right? So what authority do you have? You just know how to read text, so that's not how you learn how to do war, you're just misinterpreting everything. You don't understand the business. You don't understand how it works. And so the only way to kind of escape from that criticism is to do military history in a way that's useful to officers, and often in collaboration with officers, so they can look over your shoulder and make sure that you're doing it right. And the historians just accept that, right? They choose those collaborations. They seek them out in order to try and gain legitimacy. But the product of that, obviously, is the kind of military history that the military academy would find interesting. And so it is heavily focused on how to win pitched battles, essentially. It is heavily focused on producing lessons, on producing practical guides for officers even at the expense of the source material, because that's how the general staff writes military history. They don't really care about accuracy. They care about the lessons. They care about how they can learn to be better soldiers. And so it's a very limiting perspective. It's a very, it's a sort of tunnel vision approach to military history. You won't ever see these guys starting to write a history of, the camp followers, or a history of religion in warfare, or a history of, even something like the finances of war, because that's not what soldiers do, right? They don't engage in that kind of study. They leave that to, the Landtag in Prussia, in Potsdam, because they're interested in campaigns, battles, generalship, the practical sort of nitty-gritty of how to succeed when you're going out on campaign.
But that in itself is probably a monolith of military history until the 70s, really, when you suddenly start to get the, explorations of logistics for the first time, and some of those other aspects.
But this is the really fascinating thing that I found about these authors, and that's why I'm sort of trying to summarize this, really, because it's easy enough to describe what they do, but you can also feel a frustration with what they're not doing. And all of them are writing in their prefaces that what they really want to do is to write a military history that is fully integrated in historical society. They want to write a sort of war and society thing where they're talking about armies as the product of political and social structures, of economic systems. They want to write that kind of big picture stuff that we associate with the 1960s and 70s, this sort of new military history. They're very explicit that they think that is the right way to do it, to historicize warfare and to put it in its proper historical, social, political, economic, religious context. But they never do it because they feel that they are constrained, they feel that they can't. And so the idea that this kind of military history is new, I think, is actually wrong. It's not new. It's just that we now are able to do it because we are no longer under the scrutiny of officers who have, especially in 19th century Germany, it's an almost unimaginable level of authority vested in the army, right? These guys are gods, say, in terms of their profession. You don't criticize them. We don't look at officers that way anymore. I don't think anybody would turn to an officer to say, well, how do you feel about the history of, I don't know, the 7 Years' War? Like, no one would actually ask an officer that unless they were interested in, the practical lessons that may still be applied in training officers.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's also flipped that the ancient historian is now respected by the officer going, oh, this is your thing. You know about this. Tell me what you know about, the specialized ancient stuff, as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of something that I haven't actually brought into this book, but the fact is, I wrote my undergraduate thesis when I was a wee bairn in the Netherlands. I was very, I wasn't sure that I was going to be an academic at the time. I was just kind of going through, a basic history degree. But I wrote my thesis on the Anabasis, the Xenophon's Anabasis. And I remember at the graduation ceremony, they were reading out all these thesis titles and then giving us our diplomas, and that's all very nice. And then a guy in a uniform came up to me. He's like, I'm really interested in what you did. Like, can I read your thesis? Like, I haven't thought about this in years, but it is that. It's the idea that they're coming there. Whatever reason he was there, I don't assume that he was there to kind of hope that there was something relevant to him, but maybe. I'm assuming he was somebody's relative or somebody's dad or whatever. But he was just like, well, if you're writing on military subjects, I want to know what you said. And I was an undergrad. I didn't know anything. But even at that stage, there is already a sense that officers are like, okay, well, we want to know what you're thinking. We want to know how you're interpreting this. We want to know if there's something we can take from this. And so you're absolutely right. There's clearly a sense in which there is still a desire for that kind of knowledge exchange. And I think to some extent, maybe historians are less forthcoming in that exchange, where they don't necessarily seek out officers' help anymore. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's a bad thing. But you do still get a lot of historical studies of ancient warfare that are informed by practical experience. You do still get a lot of, even in the 20th century, a lot of Anglophone scholarship was done by people who had experience in World War II or veterans. Obviously Hammond, Pritchett, Adcock, all these guys who wrote sort of the big books of the 20th century. They were all themselves, veterans of World War II. And then you also have people like, Ian Spence or Carolyn Willicus, who are themselves like equestrians who apply that kind of knowledge to their study of ancient warfare. There are loads of people in the reenactment community who write about warfare based on their own experimentation with reconstructed armor and arms and things like that, or with smithing techniques, with the making of weapons, that kind of thing. So the use of practical experience to try and inform our understanding of ancient warfare, I think, is still very much alive. It's just that we no longer necessarily turn to officers because we now understand their business as something that is very modern, right? That is something that applies to modern practices, which are very different from historical practices. And so I think that's where there is a disconnect now. That's where we don't necessarily think that we should turn to officers in order to do military history properly. But they might still believe. I mean, there are probably still officers out there who believe that I am not a good military historian because I'm not a soldier. And similarly, I get this criticism a lot. You know, people on Twitter and places like that will always tell me, like, what do you know about this? Because you're not in the army.
Well, I don't know that Twitter's the right place for it because, you know, that's what Twitter's for. But the interesting thing for me is talking to, so my father-in-law's, 30-year career. Actually, I got tracked down by a retired soldier who sort of contacted me on Facebook and wanted to talk. And we talked in the way that your officer at your graduation ceremony came up. That's like, what can you tell me about this ancient warfare? So they know Anabasis, they know Polybius, they know, the names of works and the names of historians and the names of some battles. And they want to connect with that legacy. They want to see how their experience has built upon this ancient warfare. And they want your insights, or they've spoken to me. What are your insights on this material that I can now relate to my own experience? So there is this, they want to create this legacy of, tell me what you know about this ancient warfare world that I can go, that's very similar to what we've done. And when you read passages of Philopoemen and, some of these great figures, even Epaminondas, you can watch them nodding their heads because they understand. And I was fascinated. I did an article on, his brain's going, the Hanoi Hilton commanding officer, James, gone out of my head. Anyway, he read Epictetus. Epictetus's stoicism is what got him through 9 years of being a prisoner of war in Hanoi. So I think this
feels like a very British approach.
No, it's amazing. A U.S. Navy pilot.
Right. No, but I mean, there is still this very strong association, I think, especially in the Anglophone world, between military education and the classics. I mean, obviously, in the US, they all read Thucydides, right? They have become obsessed with the idea that Thucydides is the best guide to strategy and warfare. And so there is still this sense that at some level, these are like the original works of knowledge that everything else builds upon, in the same way that, philosophy is still sometimes characterized as footnotes to Plato. It's kind of a similar idea about military knowledge. And I think, it's obviously really great that they have an interest in ancient warfare and that they try to take what they can out of it. And especially that they will then turn to specialists like yourself to be like, okay, how can you help me ameliorate this beyond me just reading this, actually listening to an expert and seeing how you read it and how you see it. At the same time, I'm always wondering how much they feel they get out of it. And I would really like to talk to more officers about this kind of thing. So
the other world is the wargaming world. The wargamers love you talking about ancient warfare because they've got their armies, their soldiers on the table. And that's what they're doing in their head. They're refighting this ancient battle, and they know, and so when you talk about that, and yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's always been a lot of overlap, of course, between these two things. I mean, specifically within the context of these Prussians that I'm talking about, it's around the same time that the General Staff is established and tries to figure out new ways to train officers. Firstly, they start doing military history, but secondly, they're also starting to develop war games. And those two things are very much happening in tandem because they're trying to figure out how they can, A, learn lessons or gather lessons, and B, impress them upon officers. And they go hand in hand. They use military historical studies to build scenarios which they can play out on a board or in a training exercise. That's exactly what they're doing. And so those things are completely interrelated. Like they're in fact, they cannot be separated. There is an entire training method, which is called the applicatory method that comes up in the 19th century, which is precisely this. How do we translate a military historical scenario into a war game or exercise that can teach something? And that is to a large extent what the German General Staff does. And so when these scholars, for instance, are working on reconstructions of ancient battles in the ancient world, they know that officers are going to be using this, and that is the model for reconstructing battles. The way that you do that, the way that one does their reconstruction of battle, is set by the general staff doing this with the purpose of turning them into training exercises. And so those things are not, it's not a coincidence that wargamers still feel like they're very connected to this kind of modeled form of warfare, because those things they go together so well. And they have gone together for, 150 years as a way to try and think through military problems.
I've just remembered his name. It's James Stockdale. There we are. He's the one who read Epictetus. But I'm always struck by when Desert Storm was happening and Norman Schwarzkopf was talking about, like, openly on news, interviews about he was reenacting the Battle of Cannae. And even at the time, I was like, you've just given away your entire strategy to the enemy. You've told them what you're going to do, and still it went, to plan.
Isn't every officer trying to reenact Cannae all the time?
Well, again, that's a different legacy. There's Hannibal, there's Patton, and then there's Norman Schwarzkopf. So, absolutely.
Well, but
absolutely.
it's another interesting connection, because, it's often argued that, there is an ongoing controversy over whether the Schlieffen Plan, which was obviously Alfred von Schlieffen's plan for World War I, which was not exactly followed because he was no longer chief of staff when the war actually began, but whether it was inspired by Cannae, because he wrote about Cannae. He wrote his own treatises about how this was, a perfect battle, etc. And the reason he wrote about Cannae is that he read Hans Delbrück. He didn't read the ancient sources. He read Hans Delbrück, and he was inspired by the military historian to think about this battle as a potential tactical model. And so, all these things cross-fertilize. Hans Delbrück was in an endless fight with the general staff over whether he had any authority as a military historian, because he was just a civilian with decades of reservist experience and active service in the Franco-Prussian War, but we'll forget that. They refused to give him that, right? They refused to give him legitimacy as an authority, and they fought for decades over whether he had any kind of authority to speak on historical warfare. But they were reading him, either to argue with him or not. But they were all reading him. They were all sort of feeling like he had stuff to say and that he could contribute to their understanding of warfare. And so Schlieffen read his stuff on Cannae, and he thought that's great. And he wrote his own treatises on Cannae. And historians have argued ever since whether this is, this led to the fatal mistake of trying to go wide and trying to encircle the entire French army in this great, reenactment of Sedan. I don't necessarily have a position on this, but the interesting thing is that this is about ancient warfare being modified through the eyes of a military historian, one of the ones that I've studied, and then reflecting back onto military practice and military thought in this period, and possibly having devastating consequences if we accept that link exists.
Well, I think we could talk forever about that, but I know that we've filled a podcast, so I'm going to thank you for that fascinating insight into what you've done. Thank you, Roel, and we'll hopefully have you back on, and we'll rant some more about German academics from the 19th century. And
I hope so too. Thanks very much for having me on.
And we'll see you all again soon on another Ancient Warfare podcast.